Yo, this is about to be one of the toughest power rankings we've ever had to do. Obviously, if you guys have been watching the CDL, you know that some of the matches this weekend were insane. The past few weeks have been insane, and Group B, specifically in Stage 2, has been an absolute bloodbath, with all teams in the group either 3-2 or 2-3. And so we have a ton to talk about today, going through all of these teams and power ranking them from the worst all the way to the best in the CDL, heading into the Stage 2 major. It's about to be a good time, and I am very much looking forward to it. So without further ado, let's get right into it. Let's go. Alrighty, so here is our template that we are rocking with today. We got the needs work tier, we got the in the mix tier, we've got the contenders tier, and the elite tier. So it is definitely not going to be easy. So with that said, I think we can go into our number 12, our 12th team on the list. I decided to switch it up this time around. Sometimes we would just go randomly and kind of sort them through and work that way. But this time around, we're actually gonna go straight down from 12 to 1 and talk about them all the way through. So with that said, number 12, we've got the LA Thieves, which is a disappointing one to say the least, considering the situation that they've had so far. Yo, Josh from the future here real quick, and oh my word, I was editing this video and I checked Twitter and bang, I see it. Dude, the LA Thieves have dropped Slasher, or at least bench Slasher, and brought in Draza, dude. And not only that, Temp's out and Venom's staying. So we've got Kenny, Tej, Venom, and Draza as LA Thieves starting lineup, which is just insane. So I had to pause the power rankings. It would have made basically no sense knowing that information. And so keep them at 12 because that probably makes the most sense with this roster now, not knowing anything about how they're going to play moving forward. And we'll see what happens from there. But just insane. I'll probably cut out everything else I said about LA Thieves and then just insert this and we'll go from there. So without further ado, let's keep going with this one. That's absolutely insane. We'll talk a lot about this on podcast tomorrow, but let's keep going. Let's go. LA Thieves at number 12 with a lot of question marks moving forward. And we're just going to start getting into the spiciness of the middle of these teams right here. Speaking of the London Royal Ravens, they are at number 11. This is tough because they've been pretty inconsistent. They're 2-3 in their group as a whole. They're on a 3-game losing streak right now, losing 3-1 to NYSL, losing 3-0 to the Ultra, and 3-0 to Faze. There was a round 11 on Raid against the Ultra, which again, Ultra are a great Raid team. But that series against Faze was ugly. And we know, Faze was out to prove something, of course, coming off of their loss to LAG. And they played some really good Call of Duty, to say the least. But like we talked about yesterday in the breakdown video, man, Dylan, it was tough, man. He went nearly triple negative in the game, like over 30 deaths. It was like, I can't remember the exact stat right now. I don't have it in front of me, but like 13 and 34, something along those lines. And it was some bad Call of Duty as a whole for Dylan in that series. We talked about the potential for roster changes, and I'm sure we might talk about more of that in the podcast this week. There's been so much promise with how Zed and Paul X have played. The problem is when you stack them up against, the Mutineers or other teams like the Surge or LA or the Ultra or any of these teams around there, it's like, do I trust the London Royal Ravens to perform right now? Not necessarily, but they could definitely be a middle tier team here moving forward. It comes down to how Dylan can play with his teammates and the patience that he shows. And I mean, in that Garrison hardpoint against Faze, bro, he was just spawning up, sprinting into the map, dying. It was bad. It was, I mean, it was a tough one for him. And it just creates a lot of question marks for this team moving forward. And that's why they're in the needs work tier still as well, where I think we might see a roster change for this team still with either Dylan or Shawnee moving forward. It's going to be interesting to say the least. Keep your eye on that situation as we move forward. So now we're in the mix tier. And let me tell you, this is an absolute bloodbath. This is where you get into that Group B absolute bloodbath type situation here. And there is a ton to talk about and sift through. So first up, this is really tough, but first up, man, I've got the Florida Mutineers at 10. That sucks. And again, in these power rankings, we're trying to give like the spacing of the teams on the chart, should give like a little bit of an idea of the tier gaps, like even between them. where like right now, you know, there's a little bit of a gap between London and the LA Thieves. And you can see that it's gonna get a little bit tighter here in the mix in the contenders categories, especially as we're going through this. And so, you know, that's a little bit more of a visual representation of kind of the tiers as well inside of them specifically. So with Florida as a whole, they're 2-3 in their group. And it hasn't necessarily been pretty for them. In their last 3 matches, they lost to Paris 3-1. They lost to Dallas 3-0. Of course, they beat OpTic 3-0, and then they beat the Rokkr 3-0 before Standy. And then in their first match of the stage, they lost to the Surge 3-1. So not an ideal situation with their 2 wins coming against a Standy-less Rokkr, and their other win coming against OpTic in what was going to go down as one of the weirdest back-to-back games for OpTic or any team in the CDL ever, because with them getting 3-0'd twice by Rokkr and then by Florida, and then Florida goes on to lose to Empire 3-0, who then OpTic beats. Like, pure chaos right now, and it's definitely hard to sift through. But for the Mutineers, they're so inconsistent. Awakening and Skies, we've seen the upside for them. I've talked so much about these guys with Awakening, Skies, and how much I talked about how good they have been at points. And Awakening, you know, they're 2 of the best players in the CDL. Awakening, when he's playing his best, is some of the best COD we see in the CDL. But right now with them, Neptune and Slacked are the X factors with how they've been playing. Incredibly inconsistent. Slacked inside of hardpoint, inside of S&D, has just been straight up bad. And this is where, if you're the Mutineers, you might consider a roster change, I think. Well, again, we'll talk a lot more about that on the podcast tomorrow for sure. It's just hard to have any faith in this team across all game modes. You know, in their last 6 maps, of course, that's against Dallas and against the Legion, they only won an Express S&D, and that series was just ugly as a whole against Paris, where, you know, they win the Express S&D, but like that was because Neptune was just flying towards B-Bomb and finding first bloods, and that chaos, for whatever reason, Paris was willing to play for in that map specifically just did not work to their advantage, and that, you know, allowed the Mutineers to take the dub. It was a really fun map to watch. I highly recommend going back and watching it. You know, it just felt like a very fluky map as a whole for Florida to win, just because of how Paris just kind of played it into their hands. I'm just not sure if you're gonna have any faith in them game mode to game mode with right now, with how Neptune and Slacked are playing so inconsistently across specifically hardpoint in S&D. And so overall, with losses both to Paris and Seattle in the groups, it's hard to put them higher, where like and it's hard not to think that the OpTic win feels a little fluky at this point in that series, even though it was in dominant fashion in a 3-0. So I'd like to see your guys' thoughts about Florida down below, and how that plays out for them with their losses, with how bad that loss versus the Legion was, and what your thoughts about them moving into the major this weekend is going to be very interesting, to say the least. Alrighty, so speaking of the Legion, they are coming in here, the 4th team we got to talk about here. So again, we're in the mix right here because there are a lot of teams that are very, very close together on any given day on a certain map set, could pull out different wins. It's very, very close with some of these teams right now. But again, Paris, they're 2-3 in their group. They beat the Mutineers 3-1, which is great. And their other win comes against, again, the Standy-less Rokkr. So it's hard to have them any higher than 9 right now because of that situation. That series against the Surge, they lost 3-0. The Surge looked very, very good in that series. And then you go and look at the Empire series, where there were some close moments for sure, and Legion continued to find an interesting play there, but again, they won an Express S&D, which right now still feels a little fluky early on in this year, with the Express being in the meta. As a whole with Paris, even though at moments Aqua looks incredible and he plays insanely well, even though at moments Classic goes off and plays great, even though at moments Fire and Skrapz look very good, there's so much inconsistency with this team, and it's hard to have any confidence in them going map to map. And so as a whole, could they be competitive? For sure, and that's why they're hovering right here. But the confidence just isn't there map in and map out for me to put them any higher than they are currently right now at 9. So heading on to number 8. Again, man, this gets really, really tough. The Ultra are up next, and I've got them at 8 right now. They're 2-3 in their group, you know, finishing 3rd though with the tiebreakers. And, you know, since they brought in Insight, of course, this was their first stage with Insight on the team replacing Methods. they've definitely shown some improvement. Their first 2 matches weren't great. They lost to LA Thieves in game 5 in round 11 on Miami. That was the game where Insight dropped 18 kills in the S&D for the loss. And then they got 3-0'd, absolutely smoked by Faze, but so does everyone, right? And then in their last 3 matches though, they lost to New York 3-1 in their most recent match, but they won the raid control, and against New York, that's a very good win. And then they lost the checkmate hardpoint 250 to 244 against, New York, who's been very good on checkmate. So that's very promising. And in their previous 2 matches, they beat the London Royal Ravens 3-0. They clutched up in around 11 on raid, and they were really solid in hardpoint and control in that series. And then they beat LAG 3-2 with a 6-0 in game 5 on raid. And like, we know how dominant Ultra has been on raid specifically. Shout out Carson CLS, because in their specialty on raid is winning offensive rounds, and they do a fast plant towards B, which they just like sprint up there. They get the beat bomb down on B. They win like 69% of their offensive rounds doing the fast B push. They're 5-1 on raid so far in S&D, which is a strength and a weakness, because I think teams are going to start realizing that and start vetoing it against the Ultra. So that's my biggest question for them. In series where they win, they really rely on raid S&D being that map that they kind of are guaranteed to win right now. And besides that, they're 2-2 on Miami, like 2-3 on Moscow. Like, no other map really stands out as a legit good map for the Ultra inside of Search and Destroy. Besides that, if they had a more balanced S&D, and because they've shown promise in S&D, and I really love how they play raid specifically, I would have them higher, but I don't think I can have them higher because they're solely reliant on raid inside of Search and Destroy to be their dominant game mode. So with that said, there's still a lot of upside for Ultra and for Insight in this squad moving forward. Bance again has had moments where he looks great and moments where he looks horrible. And so if we can get more consistency from Bance, that could really be something interesting for the Ultra and give them like top 5 upside, but that's just not the case right now. I think it's more likely that they end up making another roster change, I think, for Bance down the road. But I'm not going to rule out that the Ultra could still improve with Bance on the roster. We saw it last year. They were very competitive at the end of the year, with Bance, and they can still be very competitive this year with him on the team as well. It's just, I think, for that full-on upside that you're looking for a team, I'm not sure if Bance can provide that right now, but that is to be decided moving forward. So now let's head on to number 7. And these, again, are some really tough discussions because, again, the Ultra just beat them in a series, but LAG is number 7. They have a 2-3 record in the group. They were on a 5-game losing streak until they beat and had the biggest upset of the season, beating Atlanta Faze 3-2. And Silly's been really, really impressive, and he was really good in that Faze series. He was really good in their most recent dominant win versus LAT. But again, LAG is probably the most controversial team, where some people think they absolutely suck still, and they think that the Faze win was completely fluky, which there are signs of it being fluky considering the maps that they won, because they beat Faze on Miami 6-2, which Faze had only played twice, 2 other times, and they beat OpTic and they beat Dallas early in the year on that map. And so a lot's changed since then, and Dallas and OpTic were both pretty bad S&D teams, and they still, Dallas still definitely is. And then they beat them on Apocalypse Hardpoint, which again hasn't been played much, and it's a new map in the meta. And then they 6-0'd them on Express, which again, same situation, new to the meta, and a lot of question marks there also with Faze not playing that. Only one time they lost to New York on that map. So Faze was definitely trying to build their map pool against LAG, considering the match wasn't that meaningful in that series. They were both guaranteed to be in winners, and then LG was guaranteed to be in losers. And so I totally understand the argument from the Faze perspective, and it's tough for LAG. They beat the Thieves, of course, without Kenny bringing in Temp on the last second basis. But on the season, LAG is one of the best S&D teams in the CDL. They've been very, very consistent, very, very good on all the maps throughout the year. And so you gotta feel good about that. Their respawn, definitely iffy still, and it probably will be for a while. But they're going to be very competitive with teams, especially teams who are very good at S&D and aren't as good at respawns, where they can play more evenly inside of a hardpoint or a control, and then steal an S&D against a good S&D team, like someone like New York or like Faze. And if you steal the S&Ds, then suddenly you're in an interesting spot to win the series. And that's exactly what happened against Faze. So overall, long story short, with LAG, I would be fine with people having them at like 10. But I could also see teams having them at like 5. It's hard to argue against that as well because of the performance they've had against Faze. So either way, I can see both sides. I have them right in the middle at 7. And let's head on to number 6, Seattle Surge. They are a very, very interesting team. Of course, everyone's going to say they are terrible at control, which is definitely true to an extent. We've seen some improvement with them inside of control. They're an above average hardpoint and S&D team for sure this year. And 2 weeks ago, they had a very dominant win against Paris where they won 3-0, beating them in like every single map handily. And then they went on to lose 3-0 against OpTic. And then they lost, got reverse swept, which hurt real bad against the Rokkr. And they looked so good in those first 2 maps. They played Raid Hardpoint, and then they played Express S&D. And they played the Raid Hardpoint fantastic. And you're like, okay, great. You know, they're beating a Rokkr team who's definitely improving in Hardpoint, but not great in Hardpoint by any means. They win in Express S&D again, a little. I'm still hesitant to call Express S&Ds like solidified dominant wins, but we're getting there with the meta at this point. After this stage, for sure, I'll feel very confident with Express S&D wins, but they end up getting reverse swept and they got smoked in the control on Raid. Pretty handily beat in the Garrison Hardpoint. Overall, Rokkr pretty much had control of that map all the way through. The devastating Miami S&D where they got 3v1 and it all went down. Definitely really ugly S&D from Seattle there. So that's why these teams are in the mix category, and you can see how close they are all together here in the mix category. They are very close together, all 5 of these teams, and I don't think there's really any other way to go about it. They're all very, very competitive with each other, and they're all teams that could scare some of the best teams in the league. The other, you know, top 5 teams in the league makes Seattle a really interesting team with how Gunless has come alive lately. Priestahh has come alive lately, and he's played his best COD of the whole year in these last few series. And so Seattle's showing a lot of signs of life, and they probably have the most upside out of any of these teams. So it gets really, really interesting with Seattle, and I am very excited to talk more about them moving forward as well. So now into our top 5. This is interesting. We got the Dallas Empire at 5. And this is definitely maybe a little controversial. I'm not sure what people are thinking about Dallas right now. Their S&Ds in real trouble. They were 1-5 in S&Ds in stage 2 so far in their group plays. They lost both to the Rokkr. They lost a 6-4 to the Mutineers. They lost both to OpTic. But what's crazy is that on the year in round 11s, they're 5-0 in round 11s. But yet they're 1-5 so far in stage 2. So all you gotta do is just get to round 11 and they're probably going to win it, but they haven't been able to do that so far. As a whole, you still feel pretty good about them inside of Hardpoint, and they're definitely solid in control as well. But when you have these issues inside of S&D, which is so surprising considering how good they were at S&D last year so far. Shotzzy played a great series against OpTic and played great in the S&D specifically, but they couldn't clutch up. And you know, just a lot of question marks with how this team plays. ILLeY has been one of the most disappointing players so far this year with overall with how he's played, especially inside of Search and Destroy, where you'd fully expect ILLeY to be a unit, especially in a game like this. And that just has not come to fruition so far for them. So a lot of questions with Dallas, even though the upside for Dallas, we all know, is to the roof. They could be the best team in the CDL, just with like basically the turn of a switch if they can figure out S&D on these maps. But there's just a lot of question marks so far, and you cannot feel confident enough to put them above the Rokkr, who I have at number 4. Okay, so the OpTic haters are going to be like, are you kidding me? They just 3-0'd OpTic and you're going to put OpTic ahead of the Rokkr. And I get that. I understand the argument. But again, at the same point, it was Standy's debut. There was a lot of unknowns, and obviously OpTic played some bad Call of Duty in that series and got smoked big time. As a whole, you know, the Rokkr on a 3-game win streak since adding Standy. For me, it just comes down to how do you trust these teams? And I can see the argument for putting the Rokkr over OpTic. I definitely understand that, but it's definitely tough. If it came down to OpTic versus the Rokkr right now, you'd have to assume that the OpTic wins the hard points, which, you know, is very fair. The question mark is the control, because, you know, right now, the Rokkr are 3-0 in control since adding Standy. They're 4-1 in Search and Destroys, and they're 2-4 in hard points. And so There are some legit question marks there still inside the hard points with the Rokkr, which is very understandable. Priestahh still trying to get comfortable, I think, inside of the hard points especially. Accuracy still a little inconsistent inside of hard points for sure, but it's very, very close. We're splitting hairs right there with that team, and it definitely feels like OpTic has their confidence back after that Empire series, and I fully expect OpTic to be playing pretty well by the time we get to this weekend heading into the major. So with that said, we do have OpTic at number 3, shocker, shocker. And so, you know, their group record was 3-2 inside of Group B. After OpTic lost to the Rokkr, they then lost to the Mutineers 3-0. And you're like, uh-oh, there's some real problems here. But they bounced back and they beat Dallas 3-2 in a series where they played some really, really good search and destroy. It is tough after the Rokkr had to reverse sweep Seattle, and they looked really bad in those first 2 matchups and the first 2 maps. And so that's why the argument right there for OpTic and Rokkr at 3 and 4 is very, very tough, and I could see it going either way. When Dashy and Formal are finding those picks, and we heard a lot of Maven and Merc talking about that in the series, which I thought was really, really good breakdown. When those Krigs are really figuring it out and playing well, Dashy played great, and that's a huge sign for OpTic. I think Dashy definitely had a slow time kind of like adjusting back to figuring out the QBZ or what worked better for him with the QBZ or with the Krig. And, you know, pros talked about the Krig on 60 hertz versus the QBZ on 20 hertz and on the custom game servers or whatever it is. And that's come to fruition really true. And Dashy used the Krig here and dominated. So I think OpTic might have found their groove again with Dashy on the Krig and figuring out how he wants to play with the Krig in hand. And that definitely makes OpTic a pretty scary team moving into this major. That's why they're at number 3 and ahead of the Rokkr. So at number 2 here, shocker, we've got the New York Subliners, which means, of course, number 1, we've got Faze. Let's talk about New York first though. So here's where I have them in the tier list here. So I've got New York at the top of the contenders tier, which means that Faze is all alone in the elite tier right now, which is an interesting discussion considering their loss to Los Angeles Guerillas. Before that loss, that was undisputed. They were the only great team in the league. They were head and shoulders above everybody else, but it does get a little bit more interesting now. My debate here, or my, you know, kind of thought process here, is that Faze versus New York. New York's only loss of the group was to Faze. Faze's only loss was to LAG. Obviously, we already talked about the whole Faze v LAG discussion. Basically, every team that New York beat 3-1, Faze beat 3-0. So like, for example, New York, they beat the Ultra 3-1. They beat the Royal Ravens 3-1. They beat LAG 3-1. They beat the Thieves 3-2 in a reverse sweep. And then they lost to Faze 3-1. So otherwise, Faze beat the London Royal Ravens 3-0. They beat the LA Thieves 3-0. And they beat the Ultra 3-0. And so it's just that extra level of dominance across all 3 game modes that Faze brings, and especially the map pool. Their map pool is so deep right now, and they're very, very good at multiple maps in every single game mode. That's why in like a 9-game series right now with what the major grand finals would be, it's hard to see Faze losing, but you know, anything's possible. And maybe they don't even get to that point. That's very possible. That's why I have the tier difference right here between New York and between Faze, and that's why Faze is in a category of their own right now. New York is a really, really interesting team, and they could definitely compete with Faze. Like I said, in a deep map pool, it's tough to pick against Faze right now. And a Sim has been a great surprise. Mac has been playing way better. We saw Mac play fantastic in their most recent series against the Ultra. He played great. That is such a great sign for New York moving forward. You got to have Mac going off. And so as a whole, they look like a really balanced team, and a team that can be very, very competitive with anyone and everyone. And they're going to be in a really good spot to be very competitive in this major as well. So I hope you guys enjoyed this one. I will definitely be interested to see all of your spicy comments down below. Drop them all down below. I will love to see them. And let me know what you guys think about this. It's definitely going to be interesting, to say the least. Again, if you enjoyed the video, like, comment, subscribe, share the video if you guys really enjoyed it. But as always, guys, I'm your boy, Faze, and guys, we will see you next time. I'm out.